overview of the hour, our opportunity is we're really going to focus on climate change for about the first 20 minutes or so, and then water quality as well. We think it's a lot more interesting to have sort of a back and forth discussion. So we're going to tee off each conversation. I'll be teeing off with Mary, and then Tiff will tee off with Brian. And we have already some questions from many of you. Thank you so much. But hopefully if we can manage it and it's still, Zoom safe, it'd be lovely to have a little bit more back and forth and a little bit more real-time conversation. So first I'm going to focus on climate change. And actually, Tiff, have I forgotten anything, or am I okay so far?
No, I think that's good.
Okay, great.
I've been checking it off. Yep.
So first I'm going to focus on climate change. And I want to first introduce you, in case you guys aren't aware, there's so many resources online, it can get mind-boggling. There is a nonprofit here in Vermont called Energy Action Network that every year does a really robust, since like 2014, analysis of where we stand with regards to our various energy-related goals, what we would save in terms of money individually as a state, where our best opportunities are for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And their most recent report, if you Google Energy Action Network, you can find them. It is called Energy Emissions, Economy, and Equity. And for those of you who are not, living and breathing climate change, I happen to work in clean energy for the last 12 years, and before that it was water quality. For those of you who don't live and breathe it, the biggest producer of greenhouse gas emissions comes from our use of energy. That doesn't mean there aren't other producers, but it's typically our use of energy. And in the energy world, we typically call it either from the transportation sector or from the electricity sector, such as, our power or our utility, and then from the thermal sector, so how we heat and cool and power up our buildings. And this is not going to be very helpful, but this is an example. Sorry, this is like the worst way to do it. That basically shows you where we've made headway and where our largest sectors in terms of use of energy and greenhouse gas emissions currently reside. Right now, for Vermont, our largest usage is in transportation, followed by thermal, followed by power. And that's partially because in our energy world, the area that is easiest to regulate, the area that is easiest to say, you must do this, here's your carrot and here's your stick, is our electricity providers. So that is where we have seen a lot of renewable advances, a lot of energy efficiency advances, and therefore there's been a lot of focus over the most recent years in terms of what can we do in the transportation and what can we do in terms of the thermal areas. And with that, I thought, Mary, we could start off with a focus on the most recent success, the Global Warming Solutions Act, and maybe you could give a little bit of background in terms of why this is important, how many other northeastern states have one of these, and how it relates to all of those other goals that we have, if it's thermal or power or transportation.
I think that it was a nice way to end my legislative career. There was so many failures along the way regarding promoting climate, and that was it was passed on my birthday on September 9th, and about a week and a half later, I think we overrode the governor's veto. And what it does, in 2006, while I wasn't in the legislature, I had left, I served through the 90s and then went back in the, I ran again in 2014. So while I was away, they actually passed really strong reduction goals. And we received, as a state, a lot of accolades for passing such strong goals, and people thought it was amazing. And year after year, we ignored them. We really did nothing about them. I never understood why people thought it was pretty cool to have goals that you just ignore. And budgets would come through that did not reflect that at all. And so I know that our, while unlike other states in New England, whose emissions have been going down, ours continue to go up. And so the Global Warming Solutions Act will take these goals, and I don't have the exact numbers. I do know there's intermittent steps along the way. I think 2030 we're supposed to have, I don't know, I think it might be 50% reduction, and then by 2050 an 80% reduction, and I might have that a little bit wrong, but if the state does not comply with that, then a citizen could actually file suit. But the only thing the citizen gets is compliance. The citizen does not get any types of rewards or monetary, anything. It's just you get compliance, and it's what we should have been doing anyway. And some of the arguments against it have been that we take the power of figuring this out of the legislature and put it into this other body. Well, the body is going to have several secretaries of the governor on it, and that is, so we're not really taking it too far out, and we do that all the time. I try to think of something that might be somewhat comparable, and I thought of electricity rate making. We don't do that. We hand it over to the Public Service Board. We could if we wanted to, but we don't have the expertise, and we're a part-time legislature without any staff. So I really thought that this was the way to go, and I don't know. I don't really think that these arguments against it really hold up very well. So that was, it was one of my final votes, and I was thrilled to be there to have it. And it was really nice also to override the veto. And I have noticed that the governor especially, but there's several members of the legislature also who talk about, we can't afford it, the cost. It is so important for us as legislators to look at the cost and then look at the benefit. And when the benefit outweighs the cost, it's called an investment. And we do that in our personal lives, and we've got to be doing it in our public lives if we're going to want to move forward at all. People talk about the cost of, trying to move our transportation sector over to electricity and trying to increase public transportation. But the fact is that we have absolutely no control over the price of fuel at the pump. And my fear is that a lot of people who are at low income are going to show up at the pump one day and it's going to be over $5 a gallon, and they are going to go ballistic because that's their only means of transportation. And it's going to be way too costly. And
Mary,
it's really incumbent upon us.
Go ahead.
What's that?
Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's incumbent upon us as legislators to do that hard work and figure out where the costs and the benefits are and to move the state forward. Another argument that that I hear a lot is Vermont's emissions are too small, so it won't make a difference. And that is the other benefits. First of all, it would be nice for us to go back to start leading the way. I don't think it's been since Madeline Kuhn was governor that we were really ahead of the curve in so many areas in the environmental field. But we have really slipped lately, and we've got to start, we benefit a lot economically from that good green reputation that we built a long time ago. And, I think we send out 2.3 billion a year or so from our economy in purchasing fossil fuel. And that's a drain on our economy. It's a big drain.
Yeah,
there's so many benefits.
I was going to pick up on that because that's a theme for tonight is legislators and just generally in life. Often it comes to how much does it cost to make this change? And what you're going to hear from Brian as well is what is the cost to not make this change, or what is the value to make this change? And I'll just show you, Mary, this is again from that Energy Action Network report. You can see that it's less than what you said, thank goodness. But you can see that if we actually here in Vermont, if we met Vermont's goals to the path to Paris, which is, the Paris agreement from a few years ago, which basically says we have to stay below 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're going to try, in terms of increasing our temperature from pre-industrial age, I'm going to try to aim for staying below 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. just as a point of reference, right now, most people would say we've already increased by 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're already like a third or a halfway there. But what I wanted to show you was, again, from this report, and I'm sorry, you should just totally Google it, and all these images are available. But you can see what the drain is on the economy and what the opportunities are if we actually do figure out how to train Vermonters. It's not a 4-year degree. It can be a 1 or 2 year, certificate at, hey, one of our state colleges. If we can train Vermonters to weatherize homes, to put solar on rooftops, to put in heat pumps, and those are jobs that you can't transfer out of state. They are generally typically livable wage jobs. Yes, the first year or so might be like 13 or 14 bucks, but after a few years, you're well over 15. You're into 18 and 20, especially if you go into plumbing or electrician. And that's an opportunity to like just save so much money, not have it leave the state, really increase our energy resilience, and also make a difference in terms of climate change. And Mary, maybe you could touch a little bit, because you've worked on so many different things. The Global Warming Solutions Act, the reason why that's important is because it really sets the framework in terms of how we can require accountability. What would you say about in terms of how we've made progress in the power or electric utility compared to the transportation and compared to the thermal sectors?
Electricity, we did stuff really, really well in the 90s, and we set up the energy efficiency utility, which is Efficiency Vermont, and Burlington Electric Department does it for Burlington customers. This has, and I don't have the savings in front of me, but we have really benefited a lot. And I think that when there's transmission upgrades around New England, because we're part of the New England grid, that each state pays their share of every single transmission upgrade wherever it is. And I think we reduced our percentage of the New England grid, something like from 5% to like 6 or 7%. This saves every Vermonter a lot of money on their rates. And and of course, if you use these programs and reduce your own electricity, then you save even a lot more. But everybody saves no matter what. And so having that was good planning, and it was good foresight, and that's what we need to be doing, rather than being so afraid and talking about no new taxes. That's the big mantra. We never make a step forward when we do that. So we're really ahead on electricity savings. Transportation has just, I think we're at something like, it might have it in that report that you have, but I think it's at like 45% of our emissions.
34,
and,
yeah, 34%.
What is it?
34. That doesn't make sense.
Really? No,
yeah, that's not right. Because it says thermal is 39, which is not right. So I need to look somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay. I thought it was somewhere around,
it's more
5%. Yeah. But that's, these are dollars that are just getting drained out of the state, and we have done so little. And the interesting thing is, I've been at climate conferences where I see people who, really do things well, except then they'll drive in a big SUV or something. It's just, I think, the hardest nut to crack, because it affects our everyday life, which means we have to have really big thinking on something like that and really start this change and, make public transportation cool. I've actually heard people say, well, if people started using it, maybe we should invest in it then. And, unless they do, there's no sense investing it. Well, people aren't going to use it unless you invest in it. And, that's been shown so many times. And boy, do we love to study things in Vermont.
Mary?
We have studied.
Mary, we have a couple of questions.
Okay, go ahead.
And it'd be great to hear you maybe talk a little bit on the TCI and thermal at some point, but let's get some questions in first. So the first one is wind power dead in Vermont because people object to it? Could there be smaller projects? And then the second one, these are both sort of siting related, is I live in Burlington and was considering putting ground-mounted solar panels in my yard, but found they have to be 10 feet from the property line. That would put them in the shade of the house. The building inspector told me that a waiver wasn't possible. This means that pretty much no one in Burlington could have ground-mounted panels. Is there a way to change this? So the first is wind, and then
that. Yeah,
Just say that's
regarding
from
wind,
Thomas Hyde.
Hey, Tom.
Oh, you're muted.
He doesn't look
Or I
muted,
can't hear
that's
you,
odd.
actually.
You need a microphone.
There you
So,
go.
There you go.
I did ask the mayor, I went to one of his coffees and Karen Paul was there and they had no idea. So
I've never heard of that
to go
before.
to a higher
so-
level.
Mhm.
I was
I'd be
part of that
happy to-
legislation, so I'll be happy to connect with you after.
And I do know with, you know, with wind, the siting is very important. Like when I worked at Burlington Lecturer Department, even though we loved having our wind turbine down there, that was a demo from the 90s. It's not the place for it because the wind isn't consistent enough. You know, people always think, oh, it blows all the time down there. You really have to do your proper wind studies and figure out where the wind blows. But the other thing is, I don't think several surveys have shown that people are not opposed to wind in Vermont, at least the majority. But the people who are opposed are pretty loud and vocal. And I think it's really, really short-sighted. I mean, I love seeing that one up in Georgia, the Georgia Mountain Wind Project. I think it's a 10 megawatt project, if I'm not mistaken. But you know, it supplies a good fraction of Burlington's electricity, and it's really close. And not having to invest in long transmission lines because your power is close saves a lot of money in many ways. And, you know, we've got to get used to seeing, you know, our impact on the environment. We can't be hiding it somewhere else so that we live in a pretty little area and aren't aware of the impact that we have.
Mary, that's a great point because we all go to gas stations and that's part of it, right? I have another question for you. And I've never heard anyone say gas stations are beautiful. So another question, this is from Jamie Hand. The traditional energy efficiency approach has been to incentivize efficiency measures, and there's been a reluctance to incentivize fuel switching. I think fuel switching, this is basically or maybe you can explain it, Mary, when you speak, but I think fuel switching, e.g. electrifying, is very important to reducing emissions. Can you talk about policy changes that need to happen to allow us to move from fossil fuels to clean electricity? Thanks.
I wouldn't be able to speak about the specifics of it. I wasn't sitting on that committee these last 2 years, energy and technology, but I do know that there was some chunk of money given to the efficiency utilities so that they can do whatever it is to, you know, that brings about the best savings. And so I assume that includes some fuel switching. But I agree, when this started, it was I think 20 years ago, that the thing was to reduce our electricity usage. And we do have to think much more broadly. At that point, they were getting people off of kind of that old-fashioned electric heat and switching them over to Vermont gas because it was a less expensive version. But now with heat pumps, we have something that's very fuel efficient and cost effective in many ways. So we do need to be thinking bigger, but that will be up to Tiff and Gabrielle to take over these issues and figure out what the next steps are.
I wonder if anyone listening has ideas about how that could be made more possible, that fuel switching. I mean, Jamie, feel free to weigh in. We do have the third tier of the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which utilities are asked to basically help customers fuel switch, but it's only a small goal. I wonder if anyone from the audience has any feedback.
Maybe we could use the waste heat from the wood burning power plant down in the Intervale to heat. That would be one single humongous change.
Savings, yep. McNeil came online in 1984, and that was always part of the complete project. It increases the efficiency of McNeil hugely. When I worked there, because I was so passionate about that project, I, would always be talking to people and how do we keep it going? And UVM would be interested and then they wouldn't be, and people would get onto other things. And I know that there's still some discussion about it, but my God, this is decades later at this point. And and it's also, I think it's in the last city's climate action plan of how we get off fossil fuels. So you can't continue to have things in your plan without implementing them.
That is still being discussed, by the way. And Jamie, if you want to, oh, great. Go ahead, JB. Nice to see you.
I posed the question sort of broadly, but I do have one example of a challenge. So I live in the South End, and we recently put in a central heat pump to replace a gas furnace. And there's a great incentive available, which is a low interest loan, or like a 0% interest loan. And it's done, I think, through Efficiency Vermont as well as Vermont Gas. And since we were replacing a gas furnace, we were advised to file for that through Vermont Gas. But the problem is that we're actually closing our natural gas account because we're moving to a heat pump. So we were sort of caught in this.
Right.
There was someone didn't think through all the potential ways this could be used, and it seemed like we were being sort of discriminated against because we were moving away from Vermont Gas.
Amy, that's really interesting and very specific, and I've made a note to follow up with you, and I'll definitely do that. We have one more question from Glenn, which is kind of related to this, and then we should shift over to water quality because we're at sort of the halfway mark. Glenn, feel free to ask your question yourself. That'd be great to hear another voice.
Well, I've always been curious about the contradictory policies on the state level we have that try to do too many things. So we really encourage aging in place, the ability of people to live wherever they want. We've got a big push for ubiquitous internet, so that wherever you live, down whatever dirt road, you have access to internet. Really dispersed settlement patterns that are very energy inefficient. And on the other hand, of course, over many decades, we've also had downtown development incentives and smart growth incentives. So we have these two state policies and money going in, which are in some ways really pulling apart the objective, if we are to look at it from an energy, but also from social and other delivery of services like healthcare and so forth. So I'm just curious about that, thinking about that approach. And Mary, I know you've been in the midst of many of those discussions, certainly, and they're not ending now, and hopefully Tiff and Gabrielle will take that forward.
The one thing I can say is I am absolutely heartbroken. I saw the Natural Resources Committee on the House side do that amazing Act 250 work that would have addressed so many more of these issues about making sure our development is in the downtowns and not scattered around the state. The Senate sent it back, mostly focused on the forestry, the trails and the contiguous forest, making sure that it's not broken up, and which was a much scaled down bill, but those were good parts. And I mean, we saw this all the time with the COVID response to, how we were legislating. And then the governor vetoed the whole thing, and we don't have the votes to override it. And I think we lost a real opportunity there. It really scares me. I hear about a lot of people from other places, from cities, moving up here, and it's perfectly fine if they, want to get a house or a condo that's, you know, currently, but we see so many people come up and want their 10 acres, you know, carved into Vermont forest. And just like they did when Act 250 was originally passed, when they saw so much in the ski areas being developed and ruining rivers, we got to get on top of this before it's too late. So I was quite heartbroken to see that hard work of the Natural Resources Committee go for naught. Hopefully there's a bill next year that can get through.
We'll take a note.
And,
so we are at 6:29, and I should pass the torch to Tiff. I just want to comment, if you're wondering what a heat pump is, you can look over Tiff's right shoulder, and there you have a cold climate air source heat pump. You know, it's amazing how many people are installing them actually for the air conditioning, but they really do work well for heat, as long as it's not like 5 degrees or below. We did have one more question. This is from Andy Simon, and I think Mary and Brian, perhaps you could both tag team it before Tiff starts to lead the water quality discussion, because it's a fundamental question to our entire being on this earth. Jumping to another level of consideration, how can we begin to resolve the fundamental tension between traditional economic growth strategies and the fact that we live on a finite planet that we are strangling with our unbridled growth? Yes to getting off fossil fuels, but even that accomplishment, should we succeed, will not be enough if we continue to build and expand our economy. And with that, Tiff, I'll pass the torch, and maybe you can segue from that question and Andy, thanks for coming off mute, but Tiff, I'll pass the torch.
Well, I just want to can I add one more thing, Tiff, before you go?
Absolutely, yeah.
This question of stressing downtown development as a way of addressing the climate emergency is very limited in a lot of ways. I mean, when VNRC and Constitutional Law Foundation supported the downtown development in Burlington, the $250 million supposedly boondoggle for SD Ireland, I was appalled. And this just seems like an example of what I was saying in that question of like, oh yeah, as long as we build downtown, that's fine. But it's not enough. I certainly support, you know, the idea of concentrating habitation, but look at the impact. Thanks.
Does anybody want to comment on that?
well, I think it's important to compare the impacts and figure out how we move forward. I mean, I think obviously we've got to get on top of the population that we have. I'm not an economist, and I would love to sit down with somebody at Gunn to get these thoughts out a little bit more. But when I hear people saying that, you know, we've got to grow the population of Vermont, you know, I think we have to make sure the people here are, you know, demographics, and that we have jobs for the people here. But the thought of just growing our you know, our population for the same, and I hear that they'll come with all of their, you know, their tax revenues. Well, people come also to, you know, they educate their kids. Their kids might have opioid. They come with all the problems that everybody else has. So I've not been a big fan of that.
I think that actually, I mean, that's a whole topic in and of itself, and I think it may warrant having another one of these at some point on that topic, because I think there are a lot of really differing views. It's something that, I mean, I think that you're right, Andy. There's an awful lot of there are kind of assumptions that are made about the benefits of downtown development, but we really need to look at that issue more holistically than I think we have time for today. If it's okay, I'd like to get into the question of water quality. And Brian is at the Gund Institute. Thanks for the segue, Mary. And is a lecturer and researcher. I'm going to let him explain because it's fascinating to me. But basically, it's almost an appreciative inquiry approach to looking at water quality and what the return on investing in higher water quality is, what the impact on the economy is, on property values, on jobs, et cetera. It's again a kind of a systemic look at an issue that's often looked at in isolation. So, and Brian, there are the questions that folks submitted as it relates to water are up at the top of the chat, and they run the gamut. But I think that, Brian, I'd like you to just quickly introduce your work and maybe some of the findings from the report that you wrote as it pertains to Lake Champlain. And we'll go from there.
Sure, sounds great. Thanks, Tiffany,
Yep.
and thanks everyone for inviting me here tonight to talk about this. I'll just take a step back and say that, and certainly don't hold this against Tiff or Gabrielle, they probably didn't know this, but I'm a Flatlander. I've lived in Vermont now for almost 17 years. And the reason I bring that up is not to call myself a Flatlander, although I do say that I'm a real Flatlander, not someone from anywhere with mountains. But I grew up in Northern Illinois, and I watched the landscape change. My family lived sort of in the corner of town, and I watched the cornfields behind my house turn into Walmarts and subdivisions, and just the cookie cutter grossness of overdevelopment. And it was at that time, I wanted to get out of the Midwest, and it wasn't until I went back and I saw what was going on there, and then started following some more of the planning related literature and environmental impacts, and really starting to get this idea about what this loss of habitat meant for wildlife, how that land use change then translated into water quality, transportation, recreation, schooling, you name it, the issues are all tied together. And so, when Andy was talking about the push for this downtown development, one thing I'll say about Vermont is that the fastest growing zoning districts in all are in our ag-res districts. So that Act 250 bill could have helped maybe address some of that. And part of that is people do want new development. People don't necessarily want to move out to the country. I live in the Mad River Valley. People don't want to move out to the countryside and then live in a busy downtown. But from my perspective, it becomes a little bit easier to manage some of the negative aspects of development with concentrated densities of people, because then it becomes more an issue of infrastructure than continued environmental degradation, certainly in these downtown areas. And so we see these changes that are happening outside of the downtown areas, loss of wetlands, loss of intact forest land, minimized stream buffers, things like that affect overland water flow and eventually end up affecting the water quality in Lake Champlain. So in about 2013 or so, the Lake Champlain Basin Program put out a call for proposals to try to quantify the value of the lake itself, clean water in the lake. And myself and John Erickson, a colleague at the University of Vermont in the Gund Institute, we put forth a proposal that said, let's take a look at this at 3 different scales. So we're going to look at the effects on property values. We're going to look at the effects on regional, sort of bigger than regional, or sorry, bigger than properties at about the town level scale of things like tourism and meals and rooms taxes, and then look at the entire region and look at things like changes in employment that result from these other factors. Now, we did this work, we were reporting out, and some of the numbers look really big. And I'll be the first to admit that some of the numbers look really, in some cases, potentially unbelievably big. And as circumstances would have it, the day that I was riding up to give my final presentation to the Lake Champlain Basin Program, the city of St. Albans, there was a story in the news about how property values for all the waterfront properties, and again, I believe it's in the city of St. Albans. This is one of my Flatlander confusions. The city-town distinction sometimes gets me. they wrote down the property values of all the waterfront homes in the town. And because of the fact that a house hadn't sold in over a year that was on the waterfront, and this was directly due to water quality concerns. Why would you buy a house on Lake Champlain if you can't go swim in Lake Champlain? So, you know, I've spent most of my career working at this intersection of people and the environment. I have a background in mathematics, undergraduate degree in mathematics and sociology, so I was kind of all over the map, a master's degree in planning. And somewhere along the way, I really got interested in using computers to apply these skills, this sort of diverse set of skills that I have, where I pull in public data, I work with survey data, and I build these computer models to try to understand, if we do this, then these are the likely effects that we'll see. And so I've been working on issues like that for more than 10 years, related to water quality, but also water quantity. In some cases too much, in other cases not enough, and how this affects people's quality of lives. And, you know, in certain cases, what kind of shortcuts people will take when the impacts of their quality of life is so severe that they have essentially no other options than to do things that might accelerate the degradation of the environment. So in terms of the findings from the Lake Champlain work, and maybe Tiff can share a link to the infographic that was put together, or if you, did I send that to you, Tiff? Because maybe we could just show
No.
it. I did not. Okay, good for me.
But I can follow up and send I can send that to folks after this.
Sure.
Yep.
I'll post the link to the report in the chat here in a minute.
Great.
But you know, the new regulations around, well, not so new anymore, but the regulations around water quality standards called for about a 35% reduction in total phosphorus in the lake. And that was going to translate, that would translate to about a 5-foot increase in visibility. So looking at the lake itself, being able to look down into the lake. And so some things that we would see as economic aspects that we would see coming out of that: 10% higher seasonal room rate for towns with lake-dependent tourism, an increase in the number of jobs, for a median price home on the lake, an increase of about $15,000 in house value. And without that, with continued decline in the water quality of the lake, certainly not lake-wide, but in certain segments of the lake, a 3-foot reduction in lake clarity, and again, in that water clarity metric, translates to about 195 full-time jobs being lost, a decline in almost $2 million in property value at a minimum, almost $17 million in lost tourism in July and August. And then effects on primary homes, again, about a 3% decrease in the primary home value, and almost a 40% decrease in the value of second homes. So folks that live outside the area, maybe not necessarily outside Vermont, but outside of the town where the dwelling is located, again, about a 40% decrease in those property values. So we look at, you know, and I live in a pretty ski-dependent area, but when we look at these second homeowners, like it or not, they are driving a large part of the economy. They do contribute to the tax base, but there are also these negative implications that we really need to get a handle on. Is it right for people to build a house that they only occupy a couple weeks out of the year? This gets to that question of who speaks for the earth. Well, I don't know. I think we all do. And I think these aren't necessarily the kinds of questions that I address through my professional work, but they're certainly things that I think about on the personal side. Anyway, you can have me back for a rant on my on personal philosophy later, but I want to stick to the water quality issue. So I'd be happy to answer questions or let Tiff reel me back in here to something a little bit more on point.
Well, you know, I did post a link to the full report, not to a particular graphic.
You can get the graphic from that report itself, but thanks.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting report. I understood about 20% of it, given your like, wow, your modeling is really interesting and a little baffling to somebody that doesn't have a PhD in your field. But the conclusion and the executive summary are totally accessible to the layperson. I guess I'd like to open this up to questions. I mean, we have some questions that people posed at the beginning. I mean, when they were signing up, and one, one of the questions is, does Vermont really have the will to clean up Lake Champlain? And I'm wondering what your perspective is on that, given the conversations you've had.
Sure. I mean, I think the short answer is that people want to try, but it's a really complicated issue. And as soon as you start pitting one interest group against another interest group, it gets even more complicated. So are we talking about, penalizing farmers for their runoff, or should we focus on the big cities that are on the lake themselves that have these sewer overflow issues every time there's a big rainstorm? Or maybe it's some combination of both. These factors are really difficult to unravel. And then when you combine that with this sort of the legacy nutrients that are in the lake, the fact, we make changes now, we might not see any benefits from those changes for 10 years. That's a political lifetime. And, political careers are born and die in that time. And so there's this real mismatch in the timescales that we need to be focused on. Hopefully you both go on to long and successful careers down in Montpelier, but you might only win once, and then somebody else is going to take over and have a completely different set of priorities. And when you're dealing with the environment, this is frankly just unacceptable. And I don't pin this on you. I'm pinning this on the political system and the way that works. And so, to me, we need some overarching guidance, some commitment that has continuity between or different administrations, that we can get to this, this point. Now, the EPA says that we're making these great strides. I myself am a little bit dubious. I do think that certain segments of the lake have gotten better. I think that public awareness around some of these issues in the lakes has definitely increased. But I don't think we're to the point yet where we could start touting the cleanup as a total success story. I do still think we have to figure out what's going to happen with agriculture. Agriculture plays a really critical role in the aesthetic of Vermont. So I'm certainly not advocating for getting rid of it, but there are some changes that need to be made. But the same thing goes with the downtown development. The same thing goes with allowing these sprawling demand patterns where folks, it's just not possible to aggregate the waste. And so instead what we have are septic systems. We've got plenty of rural areas already with large numbers of septic systems that were built way longer ago than they should have been without being replaced. And these are all things that are contributing. So even from as far away as where I live, obviously the Mad River flows into the Winooski River, flows into the lake itself. So you're dealing with this really wide swath of the population. And when you put all those different people into the mix, everybody wants to say it's somebody else's fault and it's somebody else's problem. And that's what we need to get over. And that's where we need leadership, and in cases, continued leadership down in Montpelier to achieve these goals.
Well, I'd like to open it up to folks. Given the time, what questions do you have about, or concerns do you have about water?
Can I just say one more thing about the report? Nope. Because Tiffany is totally correct that unless you're into logistic regression and multiple regression type statistics, some of that report will be inaccessible. But if you look at the infographic, again, I'll provide a link to that. That is just this one-page graphic that shows really the top level results. And if you look at that and read the executive summary, you're you're more than you'll be more than understanding the material. That said, if you're having trouble sleeping at all, you know, chapters 1 through the conclusion are definitely your friend. Just keep a copy bedside, and it'll put you right out.
Yeah, it looks like Jamie, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, Brian, if you feel like there are any like clear win policy changes that could happen that are like, you know, relatively simple to enforce and put into law or put into some other sort of policy that you would recommend as like top priorities.
You know, I think UVM's extension service and their Center for Sustainable Ag are doing some really interesting work around agriculture and improving the sustainability and the resiliency, both from an environmental perspective and an economic perspective. So for the ag sector, I think we have a lot of really interesting work going on. A lot of times this comes down to issues of funding. And, you know, if you were to ask me, do we have the will to increase taxes to pay for the things that we need to do? The short answer there is no. Again, I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but a lot of these things, you know, you have to spend money in order to make them happen. Sure, you can have, you know, programs that address individual landowners, and we've done some of that in the Mad River Valley through the Friends of the Mad River. There's a Storm Smart program where folks will go out and, you know, essentially critique your driveway and your yard and help you manage your stormwater with, you know, within your parcel. So building the infrastructure to continue and expand programs like that would be a great thing. Again, that's not necessarily a policy solution, but it's maybe something that policy could support, or folks at the State House could support through funding. I'd say the same thing about the cities on the lake, or the cities that are hydrologically connected to the lake. It's frankly inexcusable at this point to continue having these stormwater overflow issues going into the lake. You know, I've only lived here for 17 years, and I've only been hearing about this for 17 years. So if we want to take this seriously, and we want people to move into cities, yes, I do think that the cities have some of that responsibility to bear. But you know, if we can keep people from deforesting our countrysides and maintain that sort of landscape that Vermont's known for, maybe some of the benefits that we achieve out there could go to fund some of the impacts that would be realized for you know, as a result of increased development in some of our downtown core areas. I personally think it's going to take novel solutions to get at this, because again, you're talking about money. We need to look at the way that the landscape is connected, beyond just the way that our social networks work, focusing on landscape connections, which almost never respect political boundaries. So figuring out ways that municipalities can work together. If part of your watershed and the activities that you take in your watershed affect the residents that live in my town in the same watershed, but I can't issue a permit related to you, you know, that becomes really challenging. If one town thinks it's okay to have industrial close up to industrial activity close up to a waterway, and another town's trying to, you know, present at their segment of the waterway, it puts these communities at odds. And so again, that goes to this bigger vision of you know, really subscribing to these long-term goals and helping people figure out how that plays out on the landscape. But again, I do feel like for better or worse, it always comes back to money, and that we need to be creative about the way that those monetary benefits are realized. And I'll just say one more thing about this to turn it back over to the floor, but for any of you that are coffee drinkers, and I'm actually not a coffee drinker, but I learned a lot about this in my time at the Gund, because there are a lot of both coffee drinkers and people that study coffee. And so there's something known as payments for ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are the benefits that nature provide to people. So in these really big coffee producing areas, they're paying people to preserve landscape attributes that then benefit the coffee growers. And so some of the money that you know, is recouped through the sale of coffee is then translated back into landscape restoration and preservation projects. That's the kind of innovation that I think we're going to need if we're going to actually realize these you know, tangible and long-term goals as far as cleaning up the lake is concerned.
Thank you. What else?
Looks like we have a question from Andrea.
Andrea.
Rogers.
Yeah, I'm just curious how all the extreme weather variations factor in here. I mean, I have a camp on the lake, and the weather, although the water was so low, it was also extremely clear this year because we had so little rain. and other years it's been the reverse when the water has been so high. So I'm curious of how the greater extremes in weather factor into our thinking about protecting the lake.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that, Andrea. It kind of comes back to the two themes I've hit on over and over, and that is the infrastructure issues in the cities on the lake, but also this does also have an impact on agriculture, and it has an impact on agriculture from a perspective of when or if or how much manure we allow farmers to spread on fields. I mean, manure is always going to be an issue as long as we have livestock on the land. So, does that mean increasing buffer zones? Does that mean planting, bigger, more durable buffers, to keep the nutrients separate from the waterways? But as we see this increase in the number of these extreme events, these are things that we can't continue to ignore. And again, they're prickly issues. You're talking about asking people, in some cases, to change behavior that has been on the landscape for 100 or more years. You're coming in from the outside and trying to say, this is the way that we think this needs to happen. You're impacting individuals. It gets really, really challenging at that point. And so thinking about ways that we can continue to support agriculture while at the same time helping to afford to modify the agricultural behavior will be an important part of us adapting to these new extremes as well. The last thing I'll say about that, and it, again, doesn't matter if it's a farm or a city that we're talking about here, but anytime you have these events that are putting a lot of manure or human waste into the water, you're also talking about the prospect of beach closures. And once you get into a situation where beaches or segments of the lake become known for their water quality issues, that has these secondary and tertiary effects on home ownership, on property values, on restaurants, on outfitters, on guides, on all of these different businesses that we won't maybe think about our first stop on our mental tour of, if the beach closes, what happens? Well, most people think, well, that really stinks. I had my Airbnb booked for the week, and the beach has been closed the entire time because of a storm that happened a few days prior to my arrival. These are the things that will impact Vermont's tourism economy and be really difficult to overcome. So fortunately, we're not necessarily there yet with a reputation of having these major water quality issues. But again, the longer we allow this to persist, the longer we subject ourselves to the possibility that could happen.
One of the interesting case studies in your report was about Georgia, and the impact on property values, and then the subsequent impact on tax revenues for the town, a decrease in like $1.8 million, which is pretty hard for a small town to absorb. One last question before we wrap it up with, yeah. Did you have one, Andrea? No, you didn't have another one. Okay. All right.
The only point I wanted to make up on what Brian talked about, the first time, my daughter is 27 years old now. When I was pregnant conference, we worked really hard. We worked with the EPA, and we put together a really great plan. And I swear to God, we spent more money probably on hiring the graphic designer to make the cover than we put into actually implementing that plan. And stuff like that is so frustrating. If we had really gone to town back then, we wouldn't be in them. We would have saved so much money.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the state of the science as regards the lake is pretty advanced, and you know, we've made a lot of strides even in the last decade in terms of the kinds of instruments we can put in the waterways and the way that we can track nutrients and we can track all these other things. You know, the body of knowledge is there. We just need to figure out how to push enough legislators over the hump. And again, it sounds like I'm talking to a fairly sympathetic audience here, but you know, as citizens, as voters, we need to hold our legislators accountable. Even as far away as the Mad River Valley, I understand the value of a clean lake. I personally don't go up to recreate there all that much, not because I don't like it, but because I have my own little beautiful corner of Vermont. But I always do look forward when I go up to Burlington and take a walk along the waterfront. And, you know, the lake is one of the biggest economic engines that our state has. And at this point, it costs money to give it a bit of a tune-up if we want it to keep serving in that capacity.
Wow, that is a powerful statement to end on. And we've really appreciated your tuning in. And wow, thank you, Mary and Brian, for bringing your expertise to all of this. I just have a couple of quick announcements. We're going to post the recording of this, and it would be great if you would share it. And if you want to get on our mailing lists, maybe you are already, because that's how you heard about it. But if you're not, you can go to our websites and do that. And we will we'll be sending a tiny poll to you all just to solicit some feedback on this, and hear about other issues that you want to talk about. Next week's, on the 13th, is about affordable housing. A topic that came up in nearly every conversation that Gabrielle and I had as we traipsed around different parts of the district. And Brian Pine and Cindy Reed will be joining us, and they have both kind of a state and a local perspective on that issue. And can I just get and we'll be putting out information about that through social media and Front Porch Forum. Can I just get a quick thumbs up or down? Is this a useful thing for you all as residents? Okay, all right. Well, yay. You can give us feedback in the tiny poll that we send, and we hope to see some of you next week.
Thank you so much, Brian and Mary and Tiff and everybody else.
All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Have a good night.
Have a good
Thanks,
night.
everybody. Take care.
Hello, Chris Martins. Bye.
Bye-bye.